On the waters of San Francisco Bay, just as the first light of dawn broke through the sky, an old wooden vessel named Hope's Anchor rocked gently, like it was whispering the stories of the sea. Eleanor Brooks, 79 years old, stood quietly on the deck, her arms wrapped tightly around a faded photograph of her late husband, a Navy sailor, a piece of memory that time could never erase. To Eleanor, every voyage aboard Hope's Anchor was a sacred promise, to carry the families of veterans out to sea, where they would scatter flowers, light candles, and send their love to those who had fallen in service to their country. But this morning, the sea was no longer gentle. The roar of a Coast Guard engine tore through the stillness, bringing with it a cold, decisive judgment. Hope's Anchor was to be seized. The reason? Failure to meet environmental standards. Eleanor stood in silence, her gaze fixed, aching, on the vessel, the heart of her life, the home of her American dreams. Could this be the final chapter in the journey of hope? Eleanor Brooks, a woman with silver hair like morning frost and eyes deep with memory, stood quietly on the deck of Hope's Anchor, where the waters of San Francisco Bay reflected the soft light of a fading dawn. She was 79, a veteran who had served not only in war, but in the quiet battles of a life shaped by loss. In her hands, she held an old photograph. The edges were creased, the colors faded with time, but the smile of the man in the picture remained warm, vivid. Lieutenant James Brooks, her husband, long gone from this world, but never gone from her heart. Hope's Anchor was not just a wooden boat. It was a floating home of memory. It was the place where James once held the wheel each summer, carrying her out into open water. It was where they hosted special voyages for the families of veterans, scattering flowers onto the sea in solemn, sacred farewells to souls who had become one with the ocean. But that morning, instead of the soft crash of waves or the hush of wind in her ear, there was only the harsh growl of an approaching engine. A Coast Guard vessel. A young officer stepped aboard, face stern. He looked at the boat as if it were a relic, outdated, obsolete. "This vessel does not meet environmental standards," he said flatly. "The engine emissions exceed allowable limits. We are required to seize it." Eleanor said nothing. She gave only the smallest nod, her gaze fixed on the open water, on the place where Hope's Anchor had once dropped anchor, season after season, memory after memory. There was no anger, no tears, only a quiet emptiness, as if a piece of her was being pulled away with every length of rope wrapped around the ship's aging frame. Around the dock, people stood watching. Locals who had come to know this woman and her boat could only look on in silence. A few bowed their heads. Some murmured words of regret, but no one stepped forward. No one dared to face the truth, that sometimes what is right has no place in a system too rigid to feel. Eleanor stepped off the boat. Her legs trembled beneath the weight of years. She sat on a wooden bench, close to where the ship had always been moored. The photo remained pressed against her chest like a charm of protection. In her heart, the waves of memory crashed fiercely, of James, of the times he dove into the sea to help families lower flowers into the water, of the children they'd taught that gratitude must be lived, not just spoken. She did not cry. Eleanor had never cried in front of strangers, but her hands, clutching the photo, shook like torn sails in a rising storm. Then, nearly an hour later, an engine roared in the distance. A black SUV pulled up beside the dock. The door opened sharply. A woman stepped out, tall, commanding, eyes sharp as blades slicing through the early morning haze. Sarah Brooks, Eleanor's only daughter. She needed no introduction. Her sharply tailored military suit, the insignia on her chest, and the presence of someone who had seen war drew every gaze toward her. A former military attorney, a longtime officer in the Navy, Sarah was the living embodiment of the strength Eleanor had passed on. Behind her came a group, Not protesters, not guests, but veterans. Men and women who had walked the battlefield, who knew the weight Eleanor carried. Their hair was gray now, but the medals on their chests still gleamed. Their eyes were no longer sharp, but their gaze still burned like embers that would never die. They hadn't come to plead. They hadn't come to ask. They had come to claim justice. Sarah walked directly to her mother. Eleanor remained seated, nodding gently. No words were exchanged. They didn't need them. Their bond, mother and daughter, comrade and comrade, 2 generations of service, passed between them in a single glance. Then Sarah turned, facing the Coast Guard officer still standing near Hope's anchor. Her voice rang out, measured, firm, each word a round of fire cutting through the cold logic of silence. Hope's anchor is not just a vessel. It is a resting place for memory, a symbol of gratitude, a final refuge for those who gave too much. After her words, an older man stepped forward, his chest covered in medals. He spoke slowly, voice hoarse from age and time. I scattered my brother's ashes from that very ship. Eleanor and James stood with me when I had nothing left but grief. Don't let a technical report erase something sacred. Another voice followed. Hope's anchor is a floating chapel for souls who have no graves. You have no right to take it without understanding what it means. Amid the flood of voices, Eleanor remained silent, but this time she reached out and gripped her daughter's hand, and in her eyes, there was a new light. Not hope, but the quiet certainty that she was no longer alone. That day, the harbor was no longer silent, no longer afraid. It had become a spark, the awakening of memory, the rise of voices that could no longer be ignored, and Hope's anchor, though bound by rope and outdated by regulation, still beat like a living heart, holding tight to everything America must never forget. Sarah was nothing like her mother. If Eleanor was the gentle wave that caressed the shore, then Sarah was fire, quiet, fierce, and impossible to extinguish. As her mother sat silently on the bench near the dock, clutching the photograph of her late husband, Sarah strode forward toward the Coast Guard officers, toward Hope's anchor, now detained like a criminal. In her hand, she carried a thick, unadorned file. No cover, no labels, but inside it lived a history that bureaucracy had forgotten. Her voice was low, steady, and cold as steel. She didn't need to raise her voice. Each word left her mouth like an arrow, piercing the armor of indifferent protocol. This is a full record of Hope's anchor's humanitarian missions, she said, handing the file to the young officer standing guard over the impound order. From 1982 to 2004, this vessel participated in 17 missions approved by the U.S. government and the Navy. She didn't stop. She flipped to a specific page and held it up for all to see. This is a report from the 1987 medical relief campaign along the Central California coast. Hope's anchor was the only ship that could reach the shallow waters. It delivered medical equipment, supplies, and personnel to isolated fishing villages. You call that a hazard? Behind her, dozens of veterans stood as still as stone. The wind swept through silver hair and worn uniforms, but their eyes still burned. The eyes of survivors, now standing not for themselves, but for the truth. An older man stepped forward. His face, weathered and worn as if carved by wind and time, spoke before he did. He offered no name, but every step, every breath, carried the weight of memory. I'm a retired Marine, he began, his voice hoarse but resonant, like a foghorn cutting through mist. 18 years ago, we were stranded offshore in a winter storm. The waves towered like 3-story buildings. We'd all but lost hope. Then this ship, Hope's anchor, appeared, like a vision. No lights, no warning, just a single horn, and a rope that pulled us back from death. He paused, eyes rising to the ship now bound in chains like a relic from another age. You see wood and steel. We see soul. We see the heart of men who thought they had nothing left, until this boat reminded them they did. The silence that followed his words was so thick, even the bay seemed to hold its breath. The young officer, once so firm, now glanced around. His eyes wavered. Sarah didn't miss it. She stepped forward. Her voice rose, no longer cold but charged with emotion, like waves crashing against rock. Do you remember the historic floods in Lower San Pablo Bay back in 1998? When emergency response teams were paralyzed by the rising water? She pulled a faded black and white photo from the file. Hope's anchor, crowded with evacuees, slicing through floodwaters. This boat was the only one that dared enter. It carried over 200 people to safety. Children, expectant mothers, the elderly. They lived because of it. Her eyes swept the line of officers. You disregard this history? You call it an environmental threat? What about the lives it saved? The families who are alive today because of it? Do you even understand what that means? No one answered. Some of the officers exchanged uneasy glances. One pulled out his phone, as if trying to verify what she had just said. This was no longer about orders, no longer the chill of red tape. And still, Eleanor sat apart, silent in the breeze. Her hair lifted softly with the wind. Her hands still clutched the photo of James, the man who once steered that very ship through storms, the man who taught her that the sea was not just a test, but a place where the souls of the fallen could rest. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her eyes never left Sarah, her daughter, now standing firm like a mast in the center of the storm, defending not just a ship, but the very ideals James had lived for. In that moment, Eleanor no longer saw a woman confronting the Coast Guard. She saw her young husband again. His steady gaze, his decisive voice, his heart burning with devotion to the sea. Sarah had inherited her father's spirit, not by blood, but by love, for family, for community, and for everything worth preserving. The wind moved through the harbor again, but this time it didn't carry the bitter salt of helplessness. It carried something new, a wind of defiance, a wind of revival. The story of Hope's anchor is not just the story of a boat. It is a history moored deep within the heart of a family. And now, as it stands threatened by a cold, bureaucratic order, those living memories rise like the tide, washing away every boundary between past and present. James and Eleanor first met on the deck of that ship, in a time when the ocean was a theater of fire and smoke. He was a young sailor, his gaze always reaching toward the horizon. She was a volunteer nurse, carrying a small backpack, a first aid kit, and a heart impossibly wide. They needed no love song, only the hum of engines, the salt of the sea, and a single glance, shared in a place no one dared to call peaceful. They fell in love at sea, and the sea bore witness. When the war ended, James refused to let the vessel go. He wouldn't allow Hope's anchor to be dismantled like so many other military ships. Instead, he kept it, as a way to hold on to the souls of the comrades who never made it home. He rebuilt the hull, repainted every wooden panel, but he left the old wheel and the rusted windows intact. Those parts, he said, must remain, so no one forgets what happened here. Eleanor supported him. She no longer wore a medical blouse, but each time they went out to sea, she still wore the wedding ring James had placed on her finger during a stormy night, with a flashlight as witness and the waves as their blessing. Hope's anchor became a vessel of memory. James took veteran families out into open water. They brought urns, white flowers, and whispered farewells. Eleanor stood beside him, lighting candles, embracing young widows, showing children how to honor the dead with incense over the sea. No one stepped off that boat with the same heart they'd arrived with, but no one left without some piece of healing. Then, one day, James did not return. He passed in his sleep, as if the ocean had called him home, and he'd smiled in answer. Eleanor buried him on the hill overlooking the sea, a place where she could still see the shape of the boat each morning, and she made a vow, before the sea and before his grave, to carry on his promise, to take people back to the water so they could say goodbye. Hope's anchor became her entire life, not because it was all she had left, but because it was everything they had ever built. Each voyage became a story, about James, about war, about a love that would not fade. These stories were not written on paper, but carried in the wind, in the way she touched the hands of passengers, in the way she dropped flowers into the waves, eyes wide open, as if she could see loved ones waving back from the water. Sarah, their only daughter, grew up among those stories. She did not learn to steer the ship. She didn't follow in her mother's path at the helm. Instead, she chose law. She chose justice. But every time she came home, she sat on Hope's anchor, brushed the dust from her father's old portrait in the cabin, and listened to those same stories, told in that same voice, soft, steady, and deep. Sarah did not inherit Eleanor's gentleness. She was fire, shaped by nights her mother stayed awake on the boat, and by the quiet ache of losing a father too soon. She chose to fight, to wield words as weapons, to make the courtroom her battleground. Yet, in every fierce debate, she held close the image of Hope's anchor, a small boat that carried the weight of a world. To Sarah, that ship was not just where her parents had met. It was where her father's spirit remained, where her mother turned grief into compassion, where she, no matter how far she wandered, could return to find herself again. And now, as Hope's anchor faced confiscation, Sarah knew she could not stay silent. She was not protecting a boat. She was protecting a legacy, a story that could not be erased by a policy, a heart that could not be severed by smoke emissions or technical numbers. And so she stood at the harbor, not as a lawyer, not as a daughter, but as the reflection of her father, steadfast, courageous, unyielding. Eleanor saw it all. She remained on her wooden bench, still holding the old photograph, but for the first time that day, she breathed a little easier, because she knew, even as time moved forward, even as people passed on, some things stay, like the way Sarah looked out over the water, like the way Hope's anchor never stopped being a home for those no longer seen. The ship was still tied down, but its spirit was not. It lived on, in every story told, in every firm step Sarah took, in every breath Eleanor drew. The quiet pillar who never promised to be strong, but had always been the one holding the soul of the ship together. Back at the harbor, the air was stretched tight, like a string drawn to its final tension, not with anger, but with the anticipation of hope, ready to burst open. The winds sweeping across the San Francisco Bay tilted faded flags, stirring a silence heavy with suspense. Townspeople, veterans, and Coast Guard officers alike turned their eyes toward the center, toward Sarah Brooks, who stood like a mast against the storm. There was no longer anger in her voice. Now, every word rang with pride. Pride in a ship, in a mother, in a legacy that could not be erased by ink on paper. She spoke of a story many had heard, but none had ever felt with the same heartbeat she carried. The Great Flood of 1998. When large vessels couldn't dock due to shallow water and military vehicles were stranded inland, Eleanor, then in her 50s, her hands weaker than in her youth but her spirit unshakable, took hold of the wheel of Hope's anchor. She cut across rushing waters as if she were steering James's memory through a trial he once faced himself. "My mother," Sarah said, "brought over 200 people to safety. Children, pregnant women, the elderly, people who could not save themselves." The sea breeze paused, if only for a breath, as though it, too, was listening. Sarah raised her hand, pointing toward the detained ship. This vessel isn't just wood, rope, and engine. It's the lifeblood of memories we have no right to bury. It is history. It is courage. It is a witness to love and survival. And you— Her voice dropped, then rose with conviction. You cannot take it away over a few numbers on a form. Silence fell again, thick like fog across the bay. Then, a single clap, soft, firm, deliberate, and then another, and another. Applause rippled outward like waves lapping against the hull. Civilians, veterans, even the children clutching their parents' hands. They all stood. They applauded not just for one woman, not just for one ship, but for the collective memory they had nearly forgotten. Veterans raised old photographs, pictures of Hope's anchor delivering aid, photos of ashes scattered at sea, faded letters from families who had once been rescued, yellowed with time, but still legible, testaments to humanity that no bureaucracy could deny. A few Coast Guard officers lowered their heads. No one spoke, but their silence no longer carried authority. It held recognition, an unspoken apology. They had been trained to follow procedure, but no manual had prepared them for the weight of a human heart. Then, just as the moment seemed to settle, a navy blue SUV appeared at the far end of the pier. Every gaze shifted. The door opened, deliberate, silent. A middle-aged man stepped out, clad in a Navy uniform, bearing the rank of colonel. His stride was steady, not with orders, but with quiet respect. No one knew who he was, until he walked forward and nodded to Sarah. He had heard this story through an old friend, and instead of dismissing it as a minor footnote in a report, he came to see it for himself. Sarah approached him without hesitation. She handed him a folder, copies of every humanitarian record, letters of gratitude from relief organizations, and images of missions that Hope's anchor had taken part in. The colonel said nothing at first. He opened each page slowly, reading with care. Every nod from him was like a hammer striking the long-closed doors of justice. At the edge of the harbor, Eleanor still sat on the wooden bench. Her hands held James's photograph, just as they always had. But now, for the first time that day, she lifted her head. In her eyes, no longer resignation, but a fragile flicker of hope, thin as the morning mist over the bay. She rose. Slowly. Step by step, she walked toward her daughter, the one who had spoken every word she had carried in her heart for years. Each footfall echoed with memory, of stormy nights, of James's hand in hers when the sea turned violent. Sarah turned, and when mother and daughter locked eyes, Eleanor gave a small nod. Sarah understood. She reached out and took her mother's hand. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, not as comfort, but as a vow, as a promise. In that moment, all surrounding noise seemed to vanish. No more ship horns, no more arguments, only two generations. One who had steered, one who now defended, standing side by side in front of the chained vessel, as if standing before a memory no lock could contain. And from afar, the colonel looked up, still holding the folder in his hand. He didn't need to speak, because his expression said everything. He understood. The next day, San Francisco Bay no longer wore the somber hue of yesterday. The sunlight gleamed with the warmth of a faraway spring, spilling across the water and shimmering on each rippling wave. Hope's anchor, after what seemed like final moments of being taken away forever, had returned, anchoring once again in the place it belonged, the harbor where every journey of memory had begun. The ship sat quietly on the water, like an elder returning home, weathered, silent, but holding its head high. No more chains, no more doubt. But what astonished everyone most was the official announcement from the U.S. Navy delivered that morning with a sealed envelope and the signature of Colonel John Keller, the same man who had stood on that dock the day before. Hope's Anchor is not just a ship. It is a living testament to humanitarian missions, quiet courage, and memories that America cannot afford to forget. The document stated clearly, the ship would retain its original, time-worn exterior, from its wooden hull to its mast, but its engine systems would be completely upgraded with environmentally sustainable technology, not merely to restore, but to honor. And more than that, Hope's Anchor was officially designated a United States Navy civilian honor symbol with dual purpose, remembrance and education. Eleanor received the news in silence. In her hands was still the old photo of James, its edges now soft as tissue from being held so often. She gently touched his face in the picture, as if whispering, "You see, they finally understand." A few days later, Eleanor received a formal invitation from the Pentagon. She would be the guest of honor at a special memorial ceremony for veteran families and individuals who had made humanitarian contributions to the Navy. She had never stood before such a crowd, but when she stepped up to the podium, in a deep navy dress and the white silk scarf James had once given her, no one doubted the strength of her presence. "I'm not a hero," Eleanor began, her voice trembling yet clear. "I'm just a woman who loved a man and kept a promise to him." She spoke of James, of the nights rocking at sea with his hands on the wheel and her wiping the foreheads of seasick children, of the first time she scattered a soldier's ashes on behalf of a family who couldn't be there, of the hugs from strangers who had found peace on that aging ship. Each story was a thread, stitching together the hearts of everyone in the hall. Sarah stood backstage, not in the spotlight, but her eyes glistened. She had fought through legal battles, but it was her mother who had won with her heart. And Hope's Anchor, her father's ship, her mother's life work, her generation's legacy, had now become part of a nation's shared treasure. From that moment on, Hope's Anchor sailed again, not only to scatter ashes or to remember, but to teach students about gratitude, to host seminars on deck, and to give veterans a space to share their stories with a generation that had never seen war. The ship became a classroom without blackboards, a cathedral without ceilings, where every passenger was a witness, and every wave a reminder that memory never dies, as long as someone is willing to tell it. Each journey, Eleanor still sat in James's old seat, on the starboard side of the deck, her hand resting on the wheel out of habit. She didn't steer anymore. That task had been entrusted to a crew of young sailors trained by the veterans themselves. But she remained the spirit of the ship. Whenever the wind blew, whenever the waves tapped against the wooden hull, she could feel James there, beside her, his hand brushing her shoulder, whispering, "Keep going, Eleanor. Keep bringing hope." Sarah, too, would sometimes join her mother out at sea, but no longer as the legal defender of the ship, now as its storyteller. She stood on deck to speak to law students and young officers, sharing the battle she fought, talking about the right to protect memory, about laws that fall short, and how sometimes we must listen to the heart before the paperwork. Hope's Anchor was no longer just the Brooks family's ship. It had become a national symbol. Schools brought students to visit. Historical museums partnered in exhibits showcasing its legacy. And at the very harbor where it all began, a bronze plaque was installed, bearing an inscription etched deep. Hope's Anchor, because some memories deserve to sail forever. The media reported it. Filmmakers proposed adaptations, but to Eleanor, all of that was background noise. What mattered most was that with every trip out to sea, each passenger who stepped aboard Hope's anchor disembarked with a changed gaze. Lighter, fuller, quieter. The story of Hope's anchor spread across America. But it was no longer just about a ship. It was about a wife, a daughter, and a community that refused to let memory drift away. It stood as proof of something simple yet profound, that even in the darkest days when all seems lost, hope still remains, if we are brave enough to hold on to it. And the story is not over. Hope's anchor continues to glide across the waves, but this time, it carries more than ashes or memories. It carries a promise that generations will continue to step aboard that vessel to learn the meaning of gratitude, to understand sacrifice, to feel what it means to stand steady in the storm, and to choose compassion over silence. Eleanor is older now. Her steps are slower, but her eyes shine brighter than ever. She still welcomes each passenger with a gentle smile, shares the stories that have become legend, and passes on a small spark of hope, like a flame passed from hand to hand. Sarah, in her crisp suit, still joins her mother once a month, and each time she watches her in silence, as if memorizing every gesture, preparing to tell it one day to someone who needs to hear it. And you? Are you ready to step onto that ship, even if only in your imagination, to carry with you a story, a promise, or a piece of memory that has never been told? Because out there, just beyond the shoreline, there are still journeys that haven't begun, petals that have yet to be scattered, and people still waiting for a flicker of hope. Hope's anchor is still waiting for you, at the harbor of things that must not be forgotten. What will you carry when you step aboard the next voyage? Let the story continue, in the life you choose to live,